Yes, yes, I'd have to go through all the many regrets in my life and the many.
No one ever expected to hear his voice again, not after the storm of scandals, not after the profound silence that had consumed him for years. But the news of Diane Keaton's passing, it seems, changed something deep within Woody Allen, now a man of 89. The architect of irony, the master of control, suddenly sounded human, fragile, haunted by remorse and the crushing weight of all that he had lost. The woman whose laughter once echoed through the darkest corridors of his neuroses was gone, and with her, the last vestige of his own youth. What he is saying now confirms a truth we have all secretly known, a whisper that takes us back to the very beginning of everything. It began in 1969, not on a film set, but under the warm glow of stage lights on Broadway, where Woody Allen was auditioning actresses for Time's Play It Again, Sam Asterisk. We're at the Morosco Theater in New York. He was 33, already a name synonymous with wit, yet still profoundly insecure in the company of women. And then, she entered. Diane Keaton. 23 years old, an eccentric vision, beautiful in a way that was raw and unpolished. She wore a collection of mismatched clothes that had no business being on a stage, and it was for that exact reason he found it impossible to look away. He would later write that he began to question his own sanity in that moment. Was it possible, he pondered, to fall in love so completely, so quickly? She was unlike anyone he had ever encountered, too open, too wonderfully spontaneous. She was immune to the intellectual chess games that defined his universe. She read for the part, the room erupted in laughter, and the role was instantly hers. Within weeks, their lives were intertwined. Within months, she was living in his apartment. Theirs was a romance both strange and captivating, built upon a foundation of beautiful contradictions. He was the neurotic intellectual forged in Brooklyn. She was the sun-kissed California girl who made chaos itself look graceful. And he loved her. He loved her for the very things he could never quite grasp. Her magnificent lack of control, her startling honesty, her refusal to be anyone but herself. But those same qualities also terrified a part of him. He began to shape her, to direct her even off-camera, subtly suggesting what she should wear, what she should read, what she should think. Her resistance was a quiet, unyielding force. When he corrected her grammar, she would simply laugh and say the wrong word again. When he insisted on a book she should read, she'd ignore him, buying photography magazines instead. When he suggested she tone down her outfits, she would appear in something even more audacious. This soft, unbreakable rebellion was precisely what made him love her more. And it was, perhaps, also what doomed them. By 1972, Diane had accepted a role that would irrevocably alter the course of her life. Kay Adams, in a film called Time's The Godfather Asterisk. At first, Woody dismissed it. A gangster film, he mused, was simply not her style. But she went. And when she returned, she was not the same. She had worked alongside Coppola, alongside Pacino, alongside Brando, the titans of the art form. She was no longer Woody's project, she was her own creation. And for Woody Allen, control meant safety, and losing control was the prelude to heartbreak. By the end of that year, their love story had reached its final page. But neither of them would ever forget. 5 years after they parted ways, Woody Allen would do what only a filmmaker of his kind could do. He transformed his heartbreak into cinema. In 1977, Asterisk Annie Hall Times was released. It wasn't merely inspired by Diane Keaton. Times was Times Diane Keaton. Her childhood nickname was Annie. Her birth surname was Hall. The clothes she wore on screen were not chosen by stylists. They came directly from her own closet, the vests, the men's shirts, the loose ties, that offbeat charm that made her an icon unlike any other woman in Hollywood. Allen didn't just write her character. He didn't just write a role for her. He constructed the entire film from the architecture of their memory, the hesitant conversations, the aimless walks, the anatomy of their messy collapse. Every frame was a page torn from their shared diary. For him, it became a masterpiece. For Diane, it was an excavation of the heart. She was tasked with resurrecting a love that had already left her shattered, reliving it scene by scene, line by line. All of this, under the unflinching gaze of the very man who had orchestrated that original heartbreak. When Annie Hall finally lit up the silver screen, audiences witnessed a romance that breathed. It was sharp, it was tender, it was shatteringly authentic. But what they couldn't see was the truth, that they were watching two people trying to reconcile their own history in real time. The film concluded with a poignant, graceful farewell. But real life is rarely so elegant. Their actual parting had been a storm of confusion, a wound left open and unresolved. Woody had become the author of their past, transmuting the raw pain of their breakup into art, spinning the threads of regret into poetry. That year, Annie Hall claimed Best Picture. Woody Allen was named Best Director, and Diane Keaton won the Academy Award for Best Actress. On that stage, clutching the golden statuette, she was a vision of radiance. But those who knew the truth saw the tremor just beneath the surface. It was the most exquisite and the most excruciating victory of her entire life. Years later, Woody would confess, the film wasn't a love letter at all, it was an exorcism, a celluloid ritual to understand where they had gone wrong. An attempt, he said, to finally get her out of his system. But it never worked. Some ghosts refuse to fade, even when the credits roll. Diane Keaton would forever be his phantom muse, the one whose laughter echoed too loudly, whose spirit ran too wild, and who never, ever looked back. The years apart, and the ghost that stayed. When the final cut was made on Annie Hall, their romance was officially a memory, but for Woody Allen, she was an echo he couldn't escape. He brought her back just 1 year later, for Interiors, then again in Manhattan. Every few years, she would materialize in his work, a beautiful, haunting refrain. Friends and colleagues saw the pattern. It didn't matter how many new starlets he discovered, or what new chapters began in his own life. Diane Keaton was a permanent resident in his imagination, in the ink of his pen, a shadow cast over every complex woman he would ever write. By the 1980s, Keaton had forged her own legend, with films like Reds, Baby Boom, and Father of the Bride. Meanwhile, Woody's name had become synonymous with both cinematic genius and gathering controversy. Yet as their paths diverged, a quiet line of communication remained. It was a bond maintained with respect, sometimes through marathon phone calls that bled into the early morning, other times through vast oceans of silence, a silence that could be broken, suddenly, by a single, simple message, "How are you?" Then, in 1992, the ground beneath Hollywood shifted. The court of public opinion turned on Woody Allen. His deeply personal and bitter custody battle with Mia Farrow detonated into one of the industry's most volcanic public scandals, a saga thick with accusations, betrayal, and profound disillusionment. His relationship with Sunyi Previn, Mia's own adopted daughter, sent shockwaves that stunned even his most loyal allies. The tabloids branded him a pariah. Actors who once lined up to work with him now walked away. Studio executives stopped returning his calls, and in the deafening silence, one person held their ground. When Woody was casting Manhattan Murder Mystery in 1993, he made the call. He called Diane. The part was never intended for her. It had been Mia's role, but Diane stepped in, filling the void at the 11th hour. Working together after nearly 20 years felt otherworldly, like unearthing a sealed memory. And yet, it worked. The unmistakable chemistry, the flawless timing, the silent understanding between them, none of it had been lost to time. That film became their quiet reconciliation. It wasn't a romance, but something deeper, more human. It was two people who had seen every facet of each other, and still chose to show up. Through the tempests of life, the triumphs, and the tragedies, they found themselves standing side by side once more. Woody would later confess that her presence in that film saved him, not just professionally, but in the very fiber of his being. For Diane, however, it was far less complicated. She never saw herself as his defender, nor his savior. She saw a friend, a man she knew, coming apart at the seams, and she simply refused to watch him go under. What they rebuilt from that moment was not love, and it wasn't mere nostalgia. It was something more elusive, a lifelong tether that neither could fully define, but both, it seemed, needed to survive. Loyalty in the firestorm. By the late 2000s, Woody Allen had become one of Hollywood's most polarizing figures. A cultural reckoning had reopened old wounds, and the specter of allegations from Dylan Farrow returned, haunting the headlines with a new and ferocious intensity. Actors who had once lined up to work with him now spoke out, creating a careful, public distance. Film festivals quietly removed his movies. Streaming giants tore up contracts. The architect of an entire genre of filmmaking was being systematically erased from the cultural landscape. And through it all, a single, unwavering voice stood against the tide: Diane Keaton. In January of 2018, she went to Twitter, and with just 13 words, drew a line in the sand that would alter her own legacy. "Woody Allen is my friend and I continue to believe him." She attached a link to an old 1992 60 Minutes interview, where Allen had made his case, adding, "It might be of interest to take a look and see what you think." Those words would come at a cost far greater than anyone could have imagined. The phone calls from directors slowed to a trickle, then stopped. Potential roles vanished into thin air. Colleagues offered a cold shoulder in rooms that once welcomed her. The court of public opinion was merciless, branding her delusional, complicit, or worse. But the tweet remained. There was no clarification, no apology. This was not an impulse. It was a declaration of loyalty. A loyalty forged over 50 years of knowing a man beyond the two-dimensional glare of a headline. Those in their circles said she despised hypocrisy. She believed him, one source stated, plainly, not from a place of blindness, but from the vantage point of knowing the man for half a century. She had seen him at his most vulnerable, in his most private moments. For Woody, that loyalty was a lighthouse in an endless storm. "She believed me when no one else would," he reportedly confided to a friend. "She stood by me when it cost her everything. I never asked her to, she just did." And as his world continued to shrink, as critics scoffed and studios bolted their doors, Diane was a quiet presence behind the deafening noise. They spoke, but infrequently short calls, brief texts, especially after she had defended him in the press. He would send a message, a simple thank you. It had transcended romance. It had even moved beyond friendship as we know it. It was something deeper, an unspoken pact between two souls who had survived each other, and were now, in their own way, surviving the world together. When Diane was interviewed in 2023, she did not retreat, she advanced. "I'm proud," she said, her voice clear. "I'm proud beyond measure of the work we did." Her words fanned the flames of the backlash once more, but they also revealed a profound truth. She regretted nothing, not the films, not the friendship, and certainly not the loyalty that had exacted such a heavy price. For her, it was never about choosing a side in a public war. It was about holding fast to her own truth and standing by the man who, so many years ago, had been the first to see her for exactly who she was. The final call and the confession. By 2025, they were both living quieter lives, far from the blinding lights of a world that had once celebrated and condemned them in equal measure. Diane Keaton's public appearances became scarce. Scheduled events were canceled, interviews were declined, and in the rare photos that surfaced, she appeared noticeably more fragile. In the final, haunting photographs, a shadow of illness seemed to cling to her, yet she remained stoically silent, never uttering a word of her private struggle. Even her most intimate friends were unaware of the battle she waged in secret. Then, on October 11, 2025, the devastating news echoed through the industry. Diane Keaton was gone, at the age of 79. The cause remained shrouded in privacy, with official reports stating only that her passing had been sudden. A profound silence fell over the Hollywood hills, as if the very lights of the city had dimmed. But amidst the collective grief, no one felt the tremor more acutely than Woody Allen. When reporters from People Times magazine breached the walls of his inner circle, a source offered a stark, simple statement. "He is utterly distraught and blindsided." The source continued, "He had no idea she was ill. No one did." For a man who had built an empire on intellectual detachment and emotional control, the reaction was a seismic departure. Friends described a man not just saddened, but shocked into a state of absolute silence. At the intimate funeral held in Los Angeles, he moved with a deliberate slowness, appearing older than his years, and in his hands he clutched a single framed photograph. It captured a moment frozen in time, The two of them, radiant and laughing on the set of Time's Play It Again, Sam Times in 1970. Those who were there that day said the tears flowed uncontrollably. Then, just 2 days later, on October 13th, Woody Allen did something he had not done in decades. He broke his public silence to write about love. In a startlingly candid essay for Time's The Free Press Asterisk, he opened the vault of his memory, sharing fragments of Diane. The first audition, the echo of her laughter. The chaos, the undeniable beauty. When we first met, he wrote, I was convinced she was the most charming person I had ever encountered. So beautiful, so magical, that I began to question my own sanity. Was it possible to fall for someone so completely, so fast? He called her a comedic genius, a natural force of nature, a woman of impeccable judgment, he confessed, who had irrevocably shaped not only his art, but the very course of his life. But beneath the adoration, a current of regret ran deep, a deep, unmistakable regret. We had a few magnificent personal years together, he wrote, and then, eventually, we both moved on. His public explanation was pure Allen. Why we parted, only God and Freud might know, but in private, the confession cut far deeper, according to those closest to him. He admitted something he had never before given voice to, that he hadn't just loved Diane Keaton, he had tried to possess her. I loved her, he confessed, but I loved controlling her even more. That wasn't love, that was fear. It was a moment of brutal, unvarnished honesty. From a man who had spent a lifetime building a fortress of irony, it was a stunning admission. In losing Diane, he had lost more than his muse. He had lost the one person, perhaps the only person, who had ever truly understood him. A reckoning with regret, mortality, and the woman who defined him. In the twilight of his life, following Diane Keaton's death, Woody Allen's voice changed. The man who once spoke in the rapid-fire cadence of punchlines and paradoxes now spoke with the quiet gravity of a man running out of time. At 89 years old, the need to defend his art, or himself, had evaporated. Instead, he was looking back quietly, painfully, at the immutable past. In hushed, private conversations, he began to unburden himself to friends. He spoke of things he had kept buried for half a century. She saw me for who I actually was, he would say, not the filmmaker. Not the celebrity, just the insecure kid from Brooklyn. And she loved that person, even when I couldn't. Then came the admission that fractured the hearts of everyone who heard it. I should have just let her be, he lamented. I should have loved her exactly as she was, instead of trying to mold her into the woman I thought she should be. He confessed that Time's Annie Hall, Time's the very film the world celebrated as a timeless love story, had, in his heart, always been his apology to her. He admitted that she had given him everything, the film, the credibility, the very soul of his work. Without her, he said, I was just another neurotic man making comedies about other neurotic people. With her, I was telling the truth. Those who remain in his orbit say he still keeps her photograph close at hand. The very same one from 1970. Two souls, captured in a moment of pure joy, utterly unaware of the tempest that life had yet to unleash. He told a friend, just recently, her loyalty, it was a gift I never earned, yet she gave it freely. She held a belief in me when the rest of the world had turned its back, and the why of it remains a mystery. You see, the true tragedy of their story isn't that it came to a close, it's the haunting truth that, in a way, it never did. 56 years, 9 films, a lifetime of countless arguments, of deafening silences, followed by fragile reconciliations. And in the end, when the final reel began to flicker, she was there, still at the very center of his memory. The alchemist who spun his neurosis into cinematic poetry, who remained when every other shadow had walked away. The one who gave his art its very heartbeat. Diane Keaton. She was never just his muse, she was his mirror. The only soul who ever reflected the unvarnished truth back at him. Now, Woody Allen confronts the one final script even he cannot rewrite. His own mortality. His celluloid creations may grant him a kind of immortality, but he knows the real story, the one that began in the quiet intimacy of a New York audition room, and found its final, silent punctuation in a funeral photograph, will forever belong to them both. Some loves refuse to be contained by words, And some endings are not endings at all. For Woody Allen, Diane Keaton was the great what if, the woman who forever altered the trajectory of his art and his life. Was their love a story of tragedy, or was it an inevitable collision of fate? Let us know what you believe in the comments below, and don't forget to like this video, share this exploration, and subscribe for more true Hollywood stories that will stay with you long after the credits roll.